Good evening. We'll get started in a couple of minutes. We're just waiting for everybody to come in through the door. Good evening and welcome. I'm Alice Knapp, and we'll get started in a couple of minutes with the annual Joe R. Sexton Lecture Series. Good evening and welcome to the annual Joe R. Sexton series. We'll wait one more minute. I see people are still coming in, and then we'll get going. Good evening and welcome to the Joe R. Sexton Lecture Series. I am very excited to be here tonight. As you know, we had to miss last year due to COVID. And this year, not only are we lucky enough to get the same author we wanted to bring you last year, Professor Maurice Isserman, but even more importantly, what you can't see is that this is our first experiment with a hybrid program. And I am broadcasting live here from the Harry Bennett branch with some select friends of Mr. Sexton and Ann Sexton. Joe Sexton was an avid volunteer with the Friends of the Ferguson Library for 10 years. He worked on the Books for Babies program, and anybody who knew him knew he was just naturally curious. He was a World War II veteran. He worked for Exxon for years, and everything he had to do with learning something new or intellectual curiosity. So when a donor and good friend, Mr. Mel Klugman, suggested we do a lecture series in his name, we were delighted to honor that. And so each year we try to bring to you an interesting topic that we also know would interest Joe. So with that, let me introduce you to Susan LaPerla, Director of Public Services here at the Ferguson Library.
Thank you, Alice, very much. And welcome everyone to tonight's program. We're so pleased to have author and scholar, Professor Maurice Isserman with us tonight to present this year's Joe R. Sexton Lecture on his latest book, The Winter Army. Ranging from the ski slopes of Colorado to the towering cliffs of the Italian Alps, The Winter Army is a saga of an unlikely band of soldiers forged in the heat of combat into a brotherhood whose legacy lives on in U.S. mountain fighters to this day. Maurice Isserman, PhD, is the Publius Virgilius Rogers Professor of American History at Hamilton College, where he teaches U.S. history, including the history of mountaineering. A former Fulbright Grant winner, his prize-winning books include Fallen Giants, co-authored with Stuart Weaver, which was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize and the winner of the Banff Mountain Book Festival Prize for Best Mountaineering History, the National Outdoor Book Award for Best History, and the Andrew Eisman Writers Award. The Other America, a recipient of a Choice Magazine Outstanding Academic Book Award, and Cronkite's War, co-authored with Walter Cronkite IV. The Winter Army won the International Ski History Association's Award for Best Skiing History Book in 2021. Professor Isserman has written for the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, the Washington Post, and many other newspapers, as well as for numerous academic journals and contributed volumes. Please join me in welcoming Professor Isserman to tonight's program.
Thank you, Susan. It's a great honor to be here, and Joe Sexton sounds like a great library volunteer. Our local library has a Friends of the Library association, which I belong to, and I firmly believe in the mission of these kind of institutions. I only wish I could have been here in person last spring, but of course the zombie apocalypse intervened, both for the honor and also because Connecticut is my home state. I grew up in Coventry, Connecticut. Some of you may know where that is, on the other side of the river in Red Sox, Connecticut. And I don't get down to visit often enough, but I'll have to settle for this virtual return visit. So the Winter Army, which came out in the fall of 2019 in hardcover and is now also available in paperback, is my first real military history. I've written about World War II, but not about the fighting. I grew up in the 1950s and 1960s, and every adult male who I knew, from my father, these are his World War II dog tags, to the President of the United States, to my 6th grade teacher, Mr. Hammond, was a veteran of the war. But most of my knowledge of the war came decidedly secondhand. Those veterans famously were a pretty taciturn group of men, and they especially didn't like to talk about the fighting. So I had to turn to other sources. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I wish I had known this person earlier. This is Don Potter. I like to start with this picture because much of what follows is pretty grim, but this is right after the end of the war and Don Potter's return from the fighting in Italy. He's there depicted with his high school sweetheart on August 18th, 1945, in Saranac Lake, where he and Jane Chapple grew up. He's wearing his lieutenant bars and the ribbon for the Bronze Star he won for heroism in the fighting in Italy. He was in the geology department for many years at Hamilton College when I arrived here in 1990. And he was kind of a mentor to younger faculty, which I was at the time. And by, I learned about his service in the 10th Mountain Division, not about the fighting, which he never talked about, apparently not even to his own family, but about his training in the Colorado Rockies at Camp Hale, and then a story he particularly enjoyed telling about the immediate aftermath of the war. So mid-May 1945, when he traveled from Italy up to Chamonix in the French Alps, and climbed up Mont Blanc, the highest mountain in Western Europe, some 15,000 feet, with his skis strapped to his back, and then skied down. He was the first person to climb the mountain and to ski down the mountain in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. So he was one of the inspirations for this book, and I learned much more about his service from his letters, as I'll mention shortly. Next slide. But mostly I had to correct a lot of misinformation that I acquired as a child, happily going to World War II movies. Those in attendance of a certain age will remember The Longest Day, which came out in 1962, a Hollywood blockbuster featuring, every manly man actor in Hollywood, including John Wayne, who was portraying a 28-year-old 82nd Airborne lieutenant colonel, a real historical figure, at the age of 53. So he was a little long in tooth for that role, but I loved him in the role. Of course, he was big John Wayne, and I loved his lines on two separate occasions in the course of the movie. He says, "Hit the dirt, men," and in an early draft of Winter Army, I found myself writing that this particular group of soldiers, one of the 10th division regiments rather, hit the dirt, and I thought, "Oops, wait a minute, I'm sounding like an early 1960s Hollywood movie." which were not particularly realistic. I also found myself using the word heavy a lot, as in heavy shelling, heavy fighting, heavy combat, heavy casualties. And that began to strike me the wrong way, because if I say something like, after heavy fighting or after suffering heavy casualties, the men of the 10th captured the mountaintop, the emphasis is on the victory. It's not on what heavy means. Heavy is a euphemism for, in this case, for a lot of young men being killed and wounded. So I did a universal search at one point through my manuscript, and every time I came across the word heavy, if it wasn't describing something literally heavy, like the 90-pound rucksacks that the men of the 10th trained with in the Colorado Rockies, I changed it to something else. But I had to find other words. I had never been in combat. I'd never shot at anyone, never had anybody shoot at me. When I wrote about Himalayan mountaineering, it's not like I climbed Mount Everest, but I climbed other icy peaks in the Northwest Cascades and elsewhere. I'd been on glaciers. I knew what the equipment was like. So I could kind of imagine what the experience of climbing a mountain like Mount Everest would be like. But it was harder for me to get the words right to tell the story of the 10th. And I thought that the men of the 10th deserved my getting the words right. So I had to find another source. Next slide, please. And I found it in the 15 to 20,000 letters and scores of diaries and other documents from the war that hundreds and hundreds of veterans of the World War II 10th Mountain Division donated to the 10th Mountain Archives, which are in the Denver Public Library, Denver, Colorado. And here's just one of them, Sergeant Dennis Noonan, 87th Regiment, writing from Castel Diano. You see there shortly after its liberation in March of 1945, captured by the men of the 10th. And on the right-hand side, what it looks like today when I visited there a couple of summers back, and it cleaned up nicely. But Sergeant Noonan, who had a very caustic style of writing and a very cynical sense of humor, told his mother that thanks to the failures of the press and the stupidity of Hollywood, the home front has no real conception of war, and only the letters that are being sent home by guys like me, that they're the only thing where the truth can be made known. And I found those letters an invaluable resource. I had, in some instances, hundreds of letters from single soldiers back to their wives or their sweethearts or their mothers. So I really got to know them well. I felt like I knew them individually. And because, as we'll see, they tended to come from middle class or even more than middle class backgrounds, tended to be pretty well educated. The letters were very descriptive, and they continued to write even under the extremely difficult circumstances of being in a combat zone in Italy in the winter, spring of 1945. So it's not, I didn't just keep quoting the letters, but if I listened to the voices in the letters, I felt I got closer to the truth, certainly than the Hollywood version of what a World War II campaign was like. Next slide, please. So the 10th Mountain is also unique in that it came about by the initiative of civilians, particularly this guy, Charles Minot, or Minnie Dole, who a few years before World War II he was an enthusiastic amateur skier, founded the National Ski Patrol, which still exists and still patrols ski resorts to help skiers in trouble. And who was sitting around after a day of skiing in Vermont in winter, spring of 1940, talking about the resistance that the Finnish ski troops were putting up to the Red Army. The Red Army, Soviet Army, had invaded Finland. This was before the Soviet Union was one of our allies in World War II. but they were a big lumbering force confined to the roads. And these Finnish ski troops would come in from the woods and launch these daring slashing attacks. And Minnie and his friends, who were all very good skiers, a couple of them Olympic skiers, agreed that if the United States went to war, and this is still, the United States is still non-belligerent, but should the United States go to war with Germany and Italy, countries with long-standing traditions of Alpine troops, borders in Central Europe run along mountain ridges, so they needed those kind of troops. That the United States would need its own mountain troops. The United States Army was a flatland operation. Most of the bases were in the tropics or in very warm areas. They were in Hawaii, the Philippines, and in Central America and the American South. And the United States had never fought a major battle on a snowy mountain. So Minnie, who was kind of New England gentry, went to Andover, went to Yale, was an insurance executive actually in Greenwich, Connecticut, with an office in New York City, began campaigning. And he started at the top and he wrote to President Roosevelt, and he wrote to Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall, and he wrote to Secretary of War Henry Stimson. And he didn't take no for an answer, and succeeded in persuading the powers that be that the United States should indeed have this new kind of division. I mean, at the start of the World War II, the United States had no armored divisions. It had no airborne divisions, and certainly didn't have a mountain division. It had 2 cavalry divisions. So it had a lot of catching up to do. And Minnie argued in particular that in recruiting for this division, as he said to President Roosevelt, it's more reasonable to make soldiers out of skiers than skiers out of soldiers. So let's recruit among those young men who already have ski skills or mountain climbing skills or outdoor skills, which would suit them for cold weather fighting and fighting on steep terrain. Next slide, please. And so in late November 1941, just a week or so before Pearl Harbor, the Army activated the 87th Mountain Infantry Regiment, which became the kernel of what would grow into the 10th Mountain Division. And the very first recruit who showed up, who was so enthusiastic that he didn't wait to be summoned by the Army. He volunteered, as did all the early recruits, was a guy named Charles McLane. And you see him right there in front of the microphone. And he was a 1941 graduate of Dartmouth College. He had been captain of the ski team. And so he climbed on a bus in New Hampshire and rode across country and presented himself at the gate of Fort Lewis in Tacoma, and said to the bemused sergeant at the gate, I'm here to join the ski troops. He was wearing his green Dartmouth ski sweater, athletic sweater, and he was carrying his skis. And the sergeant looked him up and down and then said, son, you are the ski troops, because apart from a few non-coms and officers who were not skiers, who'd been assigned to build the division, he was the very first to show up. Singing was a kind of typical 10th Mountain Division activity, as it was in ski clubs and ski teams. And they quickly, Charles and friends here, formed a glee club for the 87th Mountain Regiment. And their favorite song, which you can listen to on YouTube, was 90 Pounds of Rucksack, which is a kind of a naughty song, so I didn't quote very much of it. As McLane's background suggests, again, these guys were tended to be pretty well educated, who skied in the 1930s. Not yet really a mass participation sport. It was expensive. This was the Depression. So you either had to be pretty well off to go to a ski resort, or you had to be a college student in the Northeast, in places like Dartmouth and Williams College, or from the Pacific Northwest, or from Colorado. So these guys came in and they all took an intelligence test, and which was administered to every newly recruited soldier. and 2/3 of them placed into officer qualifications. They all could have gone off to officer candidate school, but most of them didn't because they wanted to stay with the mountain troops. And there's only so many second lieutenants you can use in a given division. They didn't want to be reassigned to another flatland division. So they stayed as very, very qualified privates and corporals and sergeants and so on. Next slide, please. And they began their training early in 1942 in a civilian ski lodge, very luxurious compared to most Army barracks. Some of them had single rooms on Mount Rainier, which was a great place to practice their skiing. And again, their experience was so different than that of average soldier. I mean, if you join, say, the Airborne Division, the newly created 101st or 82nd, you're first going to go through basic training. You're not going to go into specialized jumping out of airplanes. Moreover, if you go into the 101st, the chances are you've never even been in an airplane, let alone jumped out of one. But these guys are all coming in and they're skiers already, and they want to be better skiers, and they want to figure out who the guys who are really good so they can become the ski instructors. So, well, they learn how to salute, they learn how to do KP, they learn the usual military stuff, but they're also immediately thrown into their specialized ski training. Next slide, please. But the problem with training in Mount Rainier was, first of all, the facilities were limited. You could only get a few hundred soldiers up there at a time. And also, it was a national park, and you cannot discharge a firearm in a national park. So that has obvious problems for a group of guys who were trying to learn how to be soldiers. So the Army built a special camp, a new camp, in what at that point had been just an empty alpine high valley, Eagle Valley at 9,000 plus feet near Leadville, Colorado, and named it Camp Hale. And one of my favorite guys was John Parker Eagle Compton, who wrote frequently to his parents from Camp Hale and then on into Italy, who was, again, from a pretty elite background. His grandfather was CEO of Ralston Purina. He, John Parker Eagle Compton, had learned how to ski in boarding school in Switzerland. So very privileged background, but when he gets to Camp Hale, he loves everything about it. He loves the Army, he loves the ski troops. Not everyone felt that way because, first of all, you're coming to 9,000 feet from mile-high Denver in a day by train, and you're going to immediately be, you're not acclimatized to that altitude, and so you're immediately going to start feeling sick. And one of the disadvantages of being surrounded by those hills is that the coal smoke from the trains that pulled in 3 or 4 daily, plus from all the furnaces and wood coal stoves and cooking stoves in the camp, gathered in a pall over the entire camp. And many men developed what was called the Pando hack. Pando was the name of a little train station there, which resembled pneumonia. They just coughed and coughed and coughed, had sore throats, until finally they grew accustomed to that. They actually looked forward to maneuvers at higher elevations because they were finally out of the coal smoke. Next slide, please. And they trained up to 14,000 feet, much higher than they were going to fight in Italy. And when you fight in the mountains, you're really fighting for control of the passes. You're not fighting for control of the summits. But the training was extremely rigorous, particularly one series of maneuvers that every veteran of it remembered thereafter. D series, D standing for division. So all, at that point, 12,000 men in the division skied out from the camp up into the high surrounding hills for what was supposed to be 5 weeks of winter training. And everything went wrong. Radios broke down. The mules carrying their food supplies couldn't reach them. They went hungry. Hundreds of men developed frostbite. They developed a real esprit de corps And again, here's John Parker saying, this is the greatest thing I ever took part in. But later on in Italy, the standard joke in the division was, and they would be under heavy fire, was if this gets any worse, it's going to be as bad as D series. So they went through a very special kind of physical training, and it really forged their identity as a unit. Next slide. And there are some of those mules, because if you're a mountain troop, you can't depend on a truck or a Jeep to get supplies to you. They had lighter weight machine guns, 30 caliber machine guns instead of the standard 50 caliber machine guns, lighter weight field artillery, which could be broken down into 200-pound units that could be carried by 3 or 4 mules. And they really hated the mules. I mean, there were some professional Missouri mule skinners among them who understood about mules, but mules proved to be very stubborn, ornery critters who were just as likely to kick you in the stomach when you weren't looking as to carry their supplies uphill. Next slide, please. And they had some of the best, if you wanted to learn how to ski, and after the first wave of recruits, who, by the way, were recruited by the National Ski Patrol, I should have mentioned that, a civilian agency solicited applications, and it was like applying for college. You had to supply 3 letters of recommendation saying, yes, I know so-and-so, he's a good skier, he's a good mountain climber, or whatever. So the initial wave of recruits, probably 5, 6, 7,000 men, were again out of that already up to snuff ski crowd. But later they began adding recruits who were athletes, who were strong, who looked promising in terms of being able to learn to ski, but hadn't previously been skiers. And if you wanted to learn to ski, Camp Hale in 1943-44 was the best place in the world to do it, because they had literally hundreds of refugee ski instructors from Austria, from Norway, some from Germany, from Finland. And these were again, the best skiers in the world, including ski champion Torger Tokle, who'd come over from Norway in 1939, was the world ski jump champion, couldn't return home because his country had been occupied by the Germans, but he was eager to go back into Europe to liberate his homeland, either directly or indirectly. And many of these, there were about 500 foreign-born European members of the 10th, and many of them became naturalized citizens in the course of the Second World War. Next slide, please. So these guys skied all day in the winter, and they did other kinds of training. But they were skiing, and on the weekends, when they had a weekend pass, they went skiing, including to a kind of rundown mining town about 70 miles away, which had a single rope tow, which had been installed a couple years earlier, called Aspen. And they would stay there at the Jerome Hotel and drink, but they would also go out skiing. And one of the people who took a good shrewd look at Aspen in that year or so was a Austrian ski instructor named Friedel Pfeiffer. And he looked at those hills, which reminded him of his native Austria. And he said, if I live through this war, I'm coming back, because this place has real potential. And he was certainly right about that. Next slide, please. So meanwhile, there was a war going on, and the 10th kept training and training and training, but nobody seemed to want them. They were peculiar. They had a different table of organization. They didn't have as many trucks and jeeps. They had mules. Their weapons were lighter. They were a light infantry division, not a heavy infantry division. General Eisenhower turned them down for use in D-Day. Surprisingly, General Mark Clark, the commander of the U.S. Army 5th Army, which fought in Italy, also turned them down. I say surprising because despite Winston Churchill's description of Italy, as he was advocating an Allied invasion of the boot in 1943, was not the soft underbelly. Anybody who's traveled in Italy knows that, apart from a few open areas around Rome and then north of the northern Apennines in the Po Valley, it's very mountainous, and few roads run through the mountains, and they're dominated by high points. And the Germans were experts at digging in on those mountaintops and zeroing in on the few roads and making it very slow progress. So after the Allied landings in September 1943, the Germans held up the Allied advance through the winter of 43, 44, until finally there was a breakout in May of 1944, and you got out into open country where Allied advantage in air power and armored power could be brought to bear. But until then, it was a very difficult advance. And meanwhile, the 10th is sitting it out. They wanted to go into combat. Some of them began to transfer into other units, into airborne units, because they didn't want to sit out the war in Colorado. But nobody seemed to want them. Next slide, please. And here's Bill Mauldin's Stars and Stripes. Mauldin, for much of 43 and into the beginning of 44, was based in Italy, and jokes about the terrain. And there's your hit the dirt catchphrase, but there was no dirt to hit for Willie and Joe at that point. Next slide, please. Finally, somebody decides that maybe indeed we can use the 10th here. The Germans have retreated to the last line of mountains before the Po Valley. When you cross the Po Valley, there are more mountains, those are the Alps, but the northern Apennines, which stretch clear across the country, were a natural barrier. If you can look at this kind of center line, there are two roads, Highway 64 and Highway 65, the few roads that penetrated the Apennines, both of them dominated by these high mountains. You can tell from the contour lines. So at the southern end of Highway 65 there, if you can make that out, is Florence. And at the northern end is Bologna. And once you're in Bologna, you're in the clear. You're in open country, you're in the industrial heartland and the breadbasket of Italy, and you can make a swift advance. But until you get up one of those roads, you're not going anywhere. And so the 10th is finally brought in at the end of December 1944 and the beginning of January 1945 to take Highway 64. The military planners decided that was the more promising way to advance. And they wanted to take the heights and then open the way for a spring offensive. So they came to the front in January and early February of 1945. Next slide, please. And there wasn't much fighting at first, but some patrols went out. And what is this mountain trooper missing? What doesn't he have? Well, he doesn't have any skis. The skis were left behind, as were much of their cold weather gear. They had really great sleeping bags, which kept them warm at 14,000 feet in the Colorado Rockies. When they got to Italy, all they had were a couple of woolen blankets, which caused a lot of grumbling. The Army works in mysterious ways. Well, they scrounged up some skis, and they sent out patrols early on in late January, early February, and they discovered something else, which is when you're skiing in Colorado at 14,000 feet, you're in deep powder snow. And so you go pretty quietly through that. You go shh, 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 through the deep powder. But when you're skiing at 4,000 feet in the northern Apennines, and most of the mountains they were on were no more than 4,000 feet, where the snow comes down, freezes, melts, refreezes, you've got corn snow. And when you try to ski through that, your skis go scritch, scritch, scritch. And so they would, ski in the dark to take out a German outpost to capture some prisoners, but they sent up this ungodly racket, and the Germans didn't have to see them. They just had to point their machine guns towards where the noise was coming from. And so quickly, the ski troopers abandoned their skis. The ski training was important in terms of their overall fitness and their unit cohesion and their morale. But in actual combat, it turned out not to be very practical. Next slide, please. So this slide should read 76 years ago, because I made it to show last year when we couldn't do this lecture. But 76 years ago, this past February, the 10th went into action. And remember, they're completely green troops. They've never been in combat. And their mission was to seize first a ridgeline, which you see on the left side of the map, called Riva Ridge, which is a series of small peaks linked together along one single ridgeline. Do that on the first night, and then on the second night to seize the Mount Belvedere Massif, a massif being a collection of linked peaks. So Mount Belvedere, the furthest on the left, on the west, linked to Mount Gorgolesco, linked to Mount della Torraccia on the right. And even further right, off the map, is Route 64. That road they wanted to remove the German control of. Now, other troops had tried to get up this mountain, the Belvedere Massif, in November, but had been driven back. And the reason they'd been driven back is because German artillery spotters on top of Riva Ridge, which there were only 100 or so men up there, but they could see every move that the attackers made, and they could call in accurate artillery fire on the Allied forces. And so what the 10th decided to do, or what their commander, George P. Hayes, decided to do, was first seize Riva Ridge, and then only then the next day seize the Belvedere Massif. This guy, by the way, Hugh Evans, who was a graduate of Exeter Prep School, and who is still with us, he's 96 or maybe 97 now, came to one of my book talks on my tour in Colorado in the fall of November of 2019. And we had dinner, and he's a really sharp guy, and asked some good questions and made some good comments during my book talk. So it was a great honor to have him. And I've had other 10th vets, one of them local to where I am in central New York, came, and he was 101 years old. And he was a real presence that evening. So next slide, please. So here's where that mountain training actually did prove useful. This is Riva Ridge, and I've stood at the bottom of Riva Ridge and looked up, and that's a steep mountainside. The German side, the other side, is fairly easy to climb up. It's wooded, it's gentler. But this was all rock, and in February it was rock and ice, and they were climbing in the middle of the night, and they were heavily laden. And so those rock climbing skills, which they'd practiced in Colorado, were actually of a lot of use. About 700 men were in the initial assault force, which got up to the summit of Riva Ridge. The Germans didn't suspect they were coming. They didn't bother to lay mines or barbed wire, because they thought those Americans could never get up that kind of mountain face. But they did, and they surprised the Germans, and they seized the high ground along the ridge line. The Germans counterattacked. Germans always counterattacked, and they had to hold on for 5 days. But they were now the ones on the high ground, and they eliminated Riva Ridge as an artillery spotting platform for the German army. Oops, next slide, please. And there's another view from below, and then from some of the troops on top of the mountain. Next slide. And this is what it looks like today, a photo I took when I visited again 3 summers back. And today it's much more heavily wooded than it was. It was largely bare in those days. Next slide, please. So the following night, the rest of the division, 10, 11, 12,000 men, go into action to seize Mount della Torraccia. And this is a different kind of attack because the Germans know they're coming. They know Riva Ridge fell. They have minefields. They have the gullies zeroed in with their mortars and their machine guns and their heavy artillery. And casualties are much heavier in seizing the mountain. And Marty Daneman, who had just turned 20 years old from Chicago and who wrote hundreds and hundreds of letters to his fiancee Lois back in Chicago, sent her. It took him a couple of weeks to write. He usually wrote on a daily basis, but he said, you know, I spotted one Kraut running across a gully I was covering and shot him. I'd always wondered how I'd feel about shooting a man, and I found out quick enough. I felt no remorse. So a very young man and a very untested green soldier did a lot of growing up in a couple of days on Mount Belvedere in February of 1945. Next slide, please. And that's what it looks like today. It's about the same height as Mount Monadnock and about the same pitch. It's not a difficult mountain to climb, but it's a lot more difficult when people are shooting at you. Next slide, please. And this guy, John Parker Compton, survives the initial battles, but he was killed in there was a few-day respite at the end of February, and then they pushed on to the next mountaintops. And John Parker Compton was killed on the assault on a little village called Eola, which I visited. There's a plaque on the right-hand side. His parents, who again were quite well off, helped rebuild the church, which had been destroyed in the fighting. And I visited the American Military Cemetery, which is just outside of Florence, after coming down from the mountains. And here is his gravestone, his cross. And I was reminded of a letter that he sent to his parents still at Camp Hale, which in some ways made me think he had a premonition of death. He was looking up at the beauty of the surrounding hills. The sun seemed to intensify the green of the firs. I'll always remember that panorama. I felt the vastness and majesty of the feeling one gets after traveling days and days on the ocean without sight of land. And in kind of classical literature, ocean voyages are often stand-ins for the experience of death. You're sailing away from the known into the unknown. And I kind of think he had a feeling he wasn't going to get back to see Colorado again. Next slide, please. So the Allied advance, the road is now open for them. And on April 14th, the 10th advances down out of the mountains into the Po Valley. They are the sharp end of the spear. Now, they're mountain troops. They're now in a valley. And you'd think they would have been pulled back, but their commander, George Hayes, knew their worth and basically kept them in the front of the Allied advance through the Po all the way up to the base of the Alps, which included a crossing of the Po Valley in boats, the Po River, excuse me. And again, these guys weren't trained to do amphibious assaults, but they pulled it off. And once the 10th and then subsequent units were across the Po, the Germans really began to fall apart, and the resistance, which had been stiff, certainly in the mountains and even in those first days of fighting in the Po Valley, began to collapse. Next slide, please. They liberated Verona, and then they moved up to Lake Garda, beautiful resort lake. Mussolini had his villa. Mussolini had been deposed, but the Germans had rescued him from imprisonment, and they put him in a villa on the side of the lake, on the west side of the lake, as the puppet leader of a northern Italian fascist government. And the men of the 10th pushed their way up the east side, their goal being to reach Riva del Garda at the north end. And you see there a highway. It's a highway crossroads, and that's the way out of Italy. If the Germans were going to succeed, if they wanted to succeed in pulling their troops across the Brenner Pass back into Austria, which of course was part of Germany at the time. That was the route they would have to follow. And so the 10th pushed on in the final days of the fighting to block that route. And as the fighting waned, VE Day wouldn't be until May 7th, but there would be a armistice in Italy on May the 2nd. Robert Ellis, who was someone else who wrote great letters and hundreds of them, typical for a man of the 10th, thought in literary terms about the final scene of All Quiet on the Western Front, the great German novel of the First World War, where the irony is that our protagonist, who survived 4 years of war, is killed on the last day of fighting. And Ellis clearly didn't want to die that way. He didn't want to die, but he certainly didn't want to die on the last day of the war. Next slide, please. And one lucky unit got to cross on ducks, Army, the amphibious vessels, to seize Mussolini's villa and rifle through his closets. And here they are dressed up in some of his gear. And one of the hats that they liberated is, you can see it in the West Point Museum. They also liberated his convertible and drag raced it up and down the western shore of Lake Garda, having a great time in doing that. Next slide, please. And so here's their route up into the Apennines, seizing the high ground, Riva Ridge and Belvedere, breaking into the Po, crossing the Po River, liberating Verona, and then reaching Riva del Garda on the last day of fighting. They were always in the vanguard, always ahead. Their motto was Sempre Avanti, always forward. They never failed to take an objective that they were given, and they were never driven from. Once they captured an objective, the Germans never drove them off of it, mountaintop or city or village or whatever their assignment was. Next slide, please. Tennessee Pass is a high pass above Camp Hale, about 10,000 feet, home to a ski resort today, Ski Cooper, and also to the 10th Mountain Memorial Stone. And there are, from the fighting in Italy, I think 990 some odd names inscribed of the soldiers who died with the 10th in Italy. And there were an additional 4,000 men of the division. So the division is 14,000 men strong. So 5,000 of that 14,000, some of them, of course, were replacements, but over a third were casualties in the fighting. In the short time they were fighting, from February till the end of April 1945. For the time they spent in combat, they had the highest casualty rate. There were divisions that were in combat for a much longer time and took much higher losses overall. But per day in combat, the 10th Mountain Division paid the highest price. Next slide, please. One more wedding photo. This one, again, Marty Daneman, all of 20 years old when he gets back to New York Harbor, makes a beeline for Chicago and marries 19-year-old Lois. There were a lot of weddings that summer of 1945. Marty was gone when I was writing this book, but I was in touch with his sons, and they kindly provided me with their parents' wedding photograph, and it's one of my favorite photographs in this slideshow. And next slide, please. So after the war, so the 10th, they fully expected to go to Japan, but then as they were landing in New York City on the beginning of August, they got the news of Hiroshima and were spared that. And the unit was demobilized, not recreated until the mid 1980s as the new 10th Mountain Division. So they were all out of the Army, and many of them, thousands of them literally, went into the ski business. They made the post-war ski business. For one thing, there were all those Army surplus skis, which the 10th hadn't brought with them to Italy, which went on sale for relatively cheap, and other outdoor equipment. And so chances are, if you were skiing in the US in 1945, 1946, you were on skis that had been intended for the 10th Mountain's use. So Pete Seibert, who worked first at Aspen, who very badly wounded during the war, he was told he was never going to walk again, let alone ski again, but he did it. He helped build up Aspen, and then he discovered a likely looking unbuilt upon mountain near Camp Hale, a place called Vale, and basically created Vale. And there's the statue of a mountain trooper in the center of Vale beneath Pete's picture. And in the map, I don't know if you can read it, but the yellow line, the main and most difficult ski route on the map, is called Riva Ridge. And there's also a Minnie's Mile in honor of Charles Minot Dole, Minnie Dole, for the founder of the 10th Mountain Division. And next slide, please. So I had to get a picture of myself in here, and you'll see me there. The upper left on Riva Ridge, about midway down the ridge, and in the background you can see Belvedere. So you can see how important Riva Ridge was to clear of the German artillery spotters. On the right, I'm sitting on the edge of a earthen depression, but was a German bunker on the top of Belvedere in 1945. And below is the Piazza 10th Mountain Division in the village of Querciola. And I just want to read you the closing lines of the book, which touch on this landscape. Along Riva Ridge and the ridgeline connecting Belvedere, Gorgolesco, and Della Torraccia today, there aren't many reminders that a great and terrible battle was fought there within living memory. A few memorials, a few markers, some shallow depressions in the earth that were once bunkers or foxholes. The barren mountainsides of 1945 are now heavily wooded. In the springtime, the hills are dark green, except where the canopy of leaves is embroidered by flowering chestnut trees, which was what was happening when I was there in May. Visible on the lower hills, the little towns like Querciola or Vidiciatico are bigger now and prosperous. The time of hunger, rubble, and violent death long gone, if not forgotten. There is a Piazza 10th Mountain Division on a quiet side street in Querciola that invites appreciative reflection in the shadow of Belvedere. The views from Riva Ridge and Mount Belvedere today are of a beautiful and peaceable landscape in an imperfect but better world. The men of the 10th helped to make it so. Sempre Avanti. And I thank you for your attention, and now am happy to entertain questions and comments.
For those of you listening at home, if you have any questions, put them in the chat. Is that correct? Put them in the chat box, and then I can relay them to Professor Isserman. And anyone here, if you would like to come up, you're welcome to do so that he can hear you by the laptop. So if you have any questions, please come up. Right. Well, we'll give people a few minutes to think about that, but I'm curious to know, how is it that you got interested in the subject and learn enough about it that you wanted to pursue this into a full book?
Well, again, my initial contact with the legacy of the 10th was through my colleague, Don Potter, who told these wonderful stories, not about the fighting, but about the training and his experience on Mont Blanc. So that sparked my interest. And then in the two other mountaineering books I've done, Fallen Giants, which is a history of Himalayan mountaineering, and Continental Divide, which is a history basically of North American mountaineering, I kept running into guys from the 10th, very famous climbers like Paul Petzelt, who was on K2 in 1938. was one of the instructors at Camp Hale in 1943, 1944, and others who came out of a mountaineering background. So I didn't have much of a background in military history, but I knew a thing or two about mountaineering, and I kind of backed into the topic from that direction.
Mhm. Are you a skier also?
Well, in a not very professional. sort of-
Dabble. You
Yeah.
dabble in skiing.
I grew up in Connecticut where we didn't do mountains, but I went for my undergraduate years. I went to Reed College in Oregon, and all of a sudden there were big white things all around. And so I did some skiing, but mostly I did mountain climbing, and that's where I became a not very skilled but very enthusiastic climber,
Mhm. Mhm.
and also a reader of mountaineering literature. Those things go together, and so. When I'd run out of things to say about other topics I'd been writing about for 20 years or so around the turn of the 21st century, I thought, I know a thing or two about mountaineering. I think that's the direction I want to go next.
Interesting. There is a question in the chat that I'll relay to you. The engraving on the granite memorial was dedicated to the 10th soldiers who died in the Po Valley and those who died in the Aleutians. Can you tell us what the 10th did there?
Yeah, their introduction to not exactly combat, but their first operation was in the Aleutians, where the Japanese had occupied a couple of islands around the time of the Battle of Midway as a diversion. And there was heavy fighting on one of the islands, and I forget its name, to drive the Japanese off. And these troops that the Allies sent in were not mountain troops and were not used to cold weather fighting. So somebody said, well, let's send one of the regiments, the 87th, the first one founded, to take Kiska, which was the remaining island. There were supposed to be 5,000 Japanese soldiers on Kiska. But unusually for the Japanese, who usually fought to the last man, they decided Kiska really wasn't worth anything to them. And under the noses of the Navy, they snuck in with small boats and submarines, and they carried the entire garrison off of the island in the days before the 87th and some other units, Ranger units and some Canadian soldiers, were scheduled to land. So the 87th made an amphibious landing on the side of slopes of this volcanic island. Nobody was shooting at them, and they pushed their way up the ridge line. And the Bering Strait, of course, has some of the worst weather in the world. And so clouds rolled in. And these green troops at night, they're on this ridge line, and they don't know if the Japanese are out there. They think they are. They have no reason to think they're not there. And they're inexperienced. And some soldiers come blundering into, where they have foxholes, and shots break out, and shots are returned. And so there was a pretty heavy firefight along the ridge line that night. And in the morning, there were no Japanese bodies, but there were 24, mostly men from the 10th, but also some Rangers and also some Canadian soldiers, 24 of the Allied invasion force who were killed from friendly fire. They'd killed each other. So it was a kind of a bitter introduction to fighting. Their sacrifice, which was heroic. They thought they were fighting the Japanese. They were prepared to fight the Japanese, but it was a useless sacrifice. There were no Japanese on the island.
Third question, how many Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria were members of the ski division, and do you know of any special acts performed by them?
I don't know how many were Jewish, although I wouldn't be surprised. This was a pretty waspy outfit. I actually did a count. There were 3 Shapiros who served in the 10th. I have the entire list of who served. 3 troopers whose last name was Chavez. 3, I forget which Italian name I searched, but 3 of them. So there seemed to be 3 of everything. And then there were 150 men whose last name was Davis, which again reflected the sort of elite New England background that a lot of these guys shared. There were certainly a lot of Austrians, but Friedel Pfeiffer wasn't Jewish. Actually, two of the von Trapp sons from The Sound of Music served in the 10th because they had ski backgrounds. But there weren't a lot of Jews. Of course, there were no African Americans, the army being segregated. There were a few Chinese troopers, but again, largely pretty waspy.
And has the 10th Division been reactivated? And if so, what do they do now?
They are still the 10th Mountain Division. They are based in Fort Drum in Watertown, New York, which is not far from where I am. And in fact, in my initial book tour, I went up to Fort Drum. This was December of 2019, and spoke to the young soldiers there who asked really good questions. You know, young men and women in uniform, many of them who had their deployment orders already for Afghanistan. The 10th has been rotating through Afghanistan and Iraq. Before that, in the Balkans. They are the most deployed unit since they were recreated in the 1980s in the US Army. Because, you know, if you think about Afghanistan in particular, they're having trained in rough terrain, high terrain, cold weather conditions. They're ideally suited for that. They, you know, it's different. They're light infantry now. They go into battle on helicopters. They don't have mules. They're not specifically, certainly not trained as skiers, and most of their training is not about mountain climbing. But they are the go-to troops for fighting in rough terrain and high terrain.
There is a comment which says your picture of Camp Hale had two very smoky locomotives in the background. Nice.
Yeah, they were, you know, burning this kind of soft coal, and you can imagine. I mean, they were protected from the mountain winds, which seemed like a good idea, but that meant that, you know, that the smoke just hung there in the air, and the ground was sooty, and, you know, their windows were sooty, their lungs were sooty. So in retrospect, it was not the best place to put that camp. Plus the fact that, you know, when they were fighting in Italy, they were fighting at 4,000, maybe 5,000. Even if they had fought in the Brenner Pass is 5,000 feet high. You didn't need to train at 14,000 feet to do that.
But did they do that intentionally, just so they would develop that kind of stamina? Or did they not know?
I think they didn't know. I think, you know, they had no experience with mountain troops. So somebody said, well, you know, Colorado mountains, yeah, let's put them up high. That'll be useful. And, you know, certainly, again, it contributed to their fitness and their elan and their unit cohesion, even if the skiing was actually not particularly useful.
Mhm. Well, does anyone here have any questions? Yeah.
Did the Germans ever use civilians as shields, or was the division ever in a position where they had to worry about killing civilians?
Yes,
Or-
that's true.
Or killing Germans just because they thought they were SOBs and just didn't deserve to live.
Yeah, the mountains were very anti-fascist. The Italians in the north were in the resistance. They were partisans. The partisans aided the 10th. And there are many memorial stones in that Castel, the village I showed in the beginning. There's a stone listing 75 or 100 names of anti-fascist fighters, but also civilians who the Germans and the Italian fascists murdered. There were other massacres in the hills. Every time, you know, a partisan killed a German soldier, the Germans would kill 10 or 20 or 50 Italian civilians. And in one notorious case, and I think this was in the fight for Iola, where John Parker Compton was killed, two figures in German uniforms suddenly appeared outside a building. And of course, the 10th shot them down. But when they got up to the bodies, they discovered that they were Italian women who had been dressed up as decoys to draw the fire of the 10th, maybe to make them reveal their position. So yeah, those kind of atrocities were quite common. And atrocities, medics were killed, and there were atrocities against men of the 10th as well.
Other questions? Yep, 1 second.
Speaking with us.
Yeah.
Professor, I understand that the
Nice.
10th was disbanded at the end of the Second World War. Was there any continuity at all for Korea? I would have thought they would have been ideal to go into Korea.
No, the Army created some smaller cold weather units. Jim Whittaker, the Whittaker brothers, who are famous in Northwest mountaineering. Jim Whittaker would be the first American to climb Mount Everest. He trained mountain troops in the 50s, but there was never a division again until 1984. And again, where were they thinking they were going to fight? They were going to fight on the plains of Germany if the Red Army invaded, and then in the Vietnam War. So there didn't seem to be a call for recreating the mountain troops. So there's no continuity, and no men from the old 10th were still in the service in the 1980s to serve in the new 10th, although the men of the new 10th, and the men and women of the new 10th, I should say, look back with great appreciation at their predecessors that are very interested in the history of the division in World War II.
When they reactivated the 10th, was it for their mountaineering and alpine experience, or was that just sort of they wanted to keep the division name because of the history?
I really should look that up. It would be interesting to write a history of the new 10th as a follow-up to this. The reason I didn't is because they fought in so many places. There's no single compelling narrative like there is for the 10th in World War II. And B, there's no archive. How do soldiers communicate today with their family? They send emails, or they Skype, or now they probably Zoom. And so historians just don't have the resources to tell a unit history in the way we do for many World War II units.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Nope. So we always like to end with a question about what your next project is. Will you be writing another book?
I will be. I'm kind of between projects now. I keep going back to my agent with suggestions. I thought about doing a history of mountain warfare more generally, but there's no, if you start with Alexander the Great and Hannibal, and then you're up with the new 10th, it's hard to establish, again, a central narrative theme. So if anybody has a good suggestion, I'll
I have your email.
I'm off in the fall on sabbatical, and if you ask me again in December, I'll have a better answer.
Great. Do you have another question? Sure.
Yeah. At least from my point of view, it sounds like there's a kind of a contradiction. You said the veterans don't like to talk about what happened.
Yeah.
Yet they wrote, sounds like very matter of fact letters home. Isn't that a contradiction?
I'm sorry. I'm.
No, if you mentioned the veterans, a lot of what the details you got were from letters the veterans wrote home.
Right.
And I'm just,
No.
why were they willing to express themselves in the letter, yet when they got home, they didn't want to talk about it?
Well, I think when the war was over, and they were so eager, these young men whose wedding pictures you saw, to start their lives and make up for lost time, to create a family and to get an education on the GI Bill, and they put aside the war memories, which is why it's such a wonderful resource that we have their letters when they were young and impressionable, and trying to share the experience directly. I mean, again, this is a generalization. Some men who were in the 10th wrote books about their experience. So they either, 10 years after, some of them 30 or 40 years after. So not everybody was reluctant. But by and large, I think that's what is said, not just of men of the 10th, but of the World War II generation. Among themselves, they could talk because they had shared this experience, and they knew that their buddies understood what they went through. But talking to civilians like me, not so much.
And we have one other question that popped up in the chat. The Finn winter troops were very effective in fighting the Russians in 1938 and 39. Were any lessons learned from them in World War II by the Americans?
Yeah, they studied the Finnish experience, and it was 39-40 when the Winter War was being fought. The thing about they were fighting on something called the Karelian Isthmus, which guards the approach to Leningrad. The Soviets wanted to seize that territory to create a buffer around Leningrad, and it wasn't really mountain fighting. It was winter fighting, but the Finns would be up in the hills, low hills, in heavily forested terrain where they were hard to spot. So they would come swooping down, onto the roads where the Red Army was confined, and that was very effective. But that wasn't the same as taking a heavily defended mountaintop or ridgeline, which is what the 10th was called upon to do. So the lessons weren't as clear as one might think. The camouflage uniforms, the whites, they picked that up from the Finns. The skis were painted white. Their weapons were painted white. So they learned some things that were useful.
Mhm. Well, that wraps it up for the questions. Is there anything you would like to share with us in parting before you go?
No, just how great it is to be visiting you in my home state of Connecticut. And I'm sure Joe Sexton sounds like he was a great guy, and he's well deserving of
Guy.
being remembered in this way. And I'm just glad I can be part of that experience.
Well, we were so happy to have you. And also you are the inaugural speaker at our first hybrid program since last March. So that's really exciting. We're all really excited to be here together.
Okay.
So thank you so much for joining us tonight. It was a really wonderful program.
Okay. Thank you.
You take care.